After 1945, many of those involved in the deaths of thousands of people hid in distant countries. Hundreds of them were found and put on trial by a simple Jew from Lvov, the future persecutor of the Nazis hiding around the world, had a dark childhood. In 1905, his parents, fleeing the Jewish pogroms, left the territory of the Russian Empire and settled in the city of Buchacha, which then belonged to Austria-Hungary and is now in western Ukraine. There, on December 31st, 1908, Simon Wiesenthal was born. His father dabbled in petty trade in 1914 in the ranks of the Austrian army. He went to war and a year later died on the Eastern Front. His widow was left with 2 boys in her arms. When the Russian troops advancing approached Buchach, the Wiesenthals fled to Vienna. A year later, they returned, but in 1916 to 1917, Buchach changed hands several times, which added to the problems of the inhabitants of the town. In 1924, Simon's younger brother died from the effects of a street injury. 2 years later, his mother remarried and left Buchach. Simon stayed to live with the family of his classmate Alfie and Silly Müller. The latter later became his wife. Simon dreamed of becoming an architect, but he could not enter the construction faculty of Lviv University. Poland, which owned Lviv at the time, had quotas for Jewish students. Wiesenthal had to study in Prague. After receiving his diploma, he moved to Lviv, where he got married and either designed buildings or worked in a factory. In 1939, after the outbreak of World War II and the annexation of Western Ukraine to the USSR, Wiesenthal became a Soviet citizen. For a while, he worked at a construction site in Odessa, but in the summer of 1941, he returned to Lviv. On June 30th, Lviv was occupied by the advancing Nazi troops. The first thing they did in the city was to kill several thousand Jews. Wiesenthals were saved by the fact that one of the leaders of the pogrom was an old acquaintance of Simon, who took pity on him and helped to get the documents for Zila in the name of Irina Kowalewska. Under this Polish name, she was later deported to Germany, where she worked throughout the war. Simon himself ended up in the Lviv ghetto, from where he was transferred to the local concentration camp Janovsky. A small miracle happened there. One of the German officers took care of the graduate architect Wiesenthal. Their cooperation was mutually beneficial. The German helped Simon to survive, and the latter drew drawings for his benefactor, which the officer sold to local contractors for good money. The patron managed to save Wiesenthal from imminent execution a couple of times. Another time, Simon earned the right to life by drawing a huge poster for Hitler's birthday. In 1943, the Janovsky camp was liquidated. The surviving prisoners were taken first to Poland and then to Germany. Wiesenthal visited a dozen camps, including Buchenwald and Mauthausen. When he was liberated by American troops on May 5th, 1945, the former big man weighed 41 kilograms. Quite quickly, he managed to find his wife. Together, they counted the family losses. The Holocaust had claimed the lives of 89 of Simon and Dzili's near and distant relatives. Their souls demanded vengeance. Already at the end of May, Wiesenthal handed over to the Americans, who were searching for German war criminals, a list containing about 100 names of concentration camp commandants, the most zealous guards, and SS members. After the war, the Wiesenthals settled in Linz, Austria. Simon became active in helping Jewish survivors and participated in the illegal transportation of Jews to Palestine. At the same time, he collected evidence of Nazi atrocities. He managed to interview 3,289 people. He He passed their testimonies to the American occupation authorities, but by the early 1950s, both the US and the USSR significantly reduced the intensity of persecution of former enemies. As a result, all the documents collected by Wiesenthal settled in the Israeli Holocaust memorial Yad Vashem. Wiesenthal did not move to Israel. What kept him in Linz was the fact that just a few blocks from his apartment lived the family of Adolf Eichmann, one of the main organizers of the final solution of the Jewish question. The SS Obersturmbannführer himself had disappeared at the end of the war and was on the list of the most wanted Nazi criminals. Gradually, Wiesenthal was able to establish that a few years the executioner hid in Austria and then through Italy flew to Argentina. In 1950, his entire family emigrated to South America. Official searches came to a standstill. Wiesenthal had to hire Argentine private investigators who in a few years established the whereabouts of some members of the family Eichmann. The investigation was spurred by the death of Eichmann's father, whose funeral was attended by the entire family. The detectives managed to photograph all the mourners at the memorial service. Wiesenthal passed these pictures to the Israeli intelligence agency Mossad. On May 23, 1960, the Israelis snatched the former Obersturmbannführer from Argentina and brought him to Tel Aviv. The Mossad made no secret of Wiesenthal's role in the whole operation, and Simon became an instant celebrity. He gave out numerous interviews and even wrote a book, I Pursued Eichmann, The Real Story, which came out a few weeks before the Nazis' trial began. At the verdict of the trial, Eichmann was executed and Wiesenthal became a freelancer for the Mossad. The Austrian authorities were not enamored of Simon's activities. It had been almost 20 years since the end of the war, and they wanted to put an end to the revelations. Wiesenthal, however, was not going to stop. However, the rapid passage of time depressed him too. The statute of limitations for Nazi crimes was then 20 years, and any day now, many unaccounted-for criminals could escape retribution. Wiesenthal organized a press campaign under the pressure of which the Austrian and German parliaments first increased the statute of limitations for Nazi crimes by 5 years and later abolished it altogether. Simon's next target was Franz Stangl. First, this man was responsible for the implementation of the Nazi program for the extermination of mentally and physically handicapped Aryans, during which 70,000 disabled people were killed. Stangl then served as commandant of the Sobibor and Treblinka death camps. During his leadership of these concentration camps, 900,000 people were killed in them. After the war, the executioner managed to get lost among the prisoners of war in an American camp. Few people came out of his clutches alive, and there were no witnesses who could identify him. Stangl managed to escape through Italy and Syria in 1951. He reached Brazil. Wiesenthal picked up his trail in 1964. He spent 3 years gathering evidence that a pensioner living peacefully in Sao Paulo was a Nazi criminal. In 1967, Franz Stangl was arrested by Brazilian authorities and extradited to the Federal Republic of Germany. There he was sentenced to life imprisonment and died in prison 4 years later. Nazis were hunted not only in South America, but also in North America. In the early 1960s, an Israeli told Wiesenthal about the Majdanek Mare, so nicknamed for the warden Hermine Braunsteiner for her love of kicking prisoners to death. When Simon checked his records, he discovered that Fräulein Hermine had been convicted after the war, but not at all for her major crimes. Before Majdanek, she had managed to labor in the Ravensbrück camp and served 3 years for her service there. Majdanek, where Braunsteiner personally drove convicted women into the gas chambers, did not appear in the sentence at all. After being released under amnesty, the mayor married an American and went with him to the United States. In 1964, Wiesenthal tracked her down in New York. At the trial, to deprive Hermine of American citizenship, she was accused of involvement in the murder of 200,000 prisoners. In 1973, she was extradited to West Germany, where in 1981 she was sentenced to life imprisonment. In prison, because of diabetes, she had her leg amputated, after which, in 1996, she was released for health reasons. Braunsteiner died in 1999, but Dr. Josef Mengele, famous for his deadly experiments on Auschwitz prisoners, managed to elude Wiesenthal. After the war, Mengele resurfaced in Argentina, where a Nazi hunter was on his trail. The extradition request was a little late. In 1958, the doctor moved to Paraguay. When he was found there, he fled to Brazil, where in 1979 he drowned while swimming. Wiesenthal did not believe the rumors of Mengele's death and announced a reward of $100,000 for information about his whereabouts. In 1985, the doctor's relatives publicly announced that he had been dead for 6 years. Wiesenthal cancelled the reward only after the exhumation of the body, which confirmed that the grave is indeed Mengele. In the early 1980s, journalists wrote that Wiesenthal managed to track down more than 800 Nazis in hiding. Such activity was not to everyone's liking. June 11th, 1982, at the house in Vienna where the family lived Simon, there was an explosion. Fortunately, no one was injured by the bomb planted by neo-Nazis, but since then, the police have been on round-the-clock duty at the house of the Nazi hunter. Wiesenthal's work was also criticized in the press. There were publications claiming that Wiesenthal had not actually searched for anyone, but was only engaged in self-piracy. Few people paid attention to these articles because their authors argued in other writings that there had been no Holocaust at all and that the myth of Hitler's extermination of the Jews had been invented by the Jews themselves. By the 1990s, most of the still unfound Nazi perpetrators had moved on naturally, and Wiesenthal gradually retired. The last executioner he discovered was SS Untersturmführer Julius Viel, who in 2001 was found guilty of murdering 7 Jewish prisoners. Simon Wiesenthal lived out his days in Vienna, writing books and not only memoirs. In one of his works, he researched the life of Christopher Columbus, proving his Jewish origin. Simon devoted all his free time to his hobby, which was recommended to him by his doctor after his release from the concentration camp to calm his nerves. Philately. Simon collected a good collection of postage stamps issued by the Zemstvo boards of the Russian Empire. In 2003, Celia died. Simon outlived his faithful wife by 2 years and died in Vienna at the age of 96. His ashes were solemnly buried in the Israeli Herzliya. After the death of the main hunter for the Nazis, his work continues. His work, founded in 1977 in Los Angeles Human Rights Simon Wiesenthal Center, which is also engaged in the study of the history of the Holocaust and the problems of anti-Semitism. The center's staff still manages to track down those who were at least indirectly involved in the Nazi death camps. Write in the comments interesting stories that you know from that time. It will be very interesting to read. Friends, thank you for watching.